Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this week's Parshat Devarim Zera Shimshon class. We're doing it remotely because a lot of people are on holiday and vacation during Ben Azmanim, so we wanted to allow and respect that space, but at the same time, we wanted to make sure that we don't stop learning Zera Shimshon for a week, even though everyone might be away or in some other place. So with that in mind, Parshat Devarim, also known as Shabbat Chazzan, is always the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av. And that's because of the Haftarah that we read about Chazon, about Yeshayahu, giving us what's going to happen in the time of the destruction of Beit HaMikdash. Generally, parts of the Haftarah are read in the tune of Eicha to remind us of what happened, to remind us of what's coming. Hopefully, we won't have to hear the tune of Eicha, but rather we'll hear the tune of the Beit HaMikdash. In this week's Zera Shimshon Shir, we're going to talk about something about Eretz Yisrael and the value of Eretz Yisrael in general, and what happened at the time of the Miraglim, because it's connected to this week's Parsha that Moshe talks about. But before we go there, let's start with a little bit of a parable, a mashal, right? When we have I recently bought a used car, and since we don't have a lot of, we didn't have a lot of money to spend on the car, I want to go to a person that's reliable, a salesman that's reliable, and ask him for some guidance and what we could do in terms of what we have in terms of uh, the car that meets our price. So, we went to a car salesman, and he offered us about when we got there, he gave us some offers of advice about what cars are available, what's within our price range, and what's good about each one. So we asked him about we asked him what we're looking for. He asked us what we're looking for. We told him we're looking for something that's reliable. We have air conditioning, right? And of course, he says, yes, of course, we can find that car. Yes, we can find a car that's reliable. That's something that's with air conditioning, etc. Uh, and in addition to that, we wanted to he wanted to look at he showed us all the various features and he said this is and then he brings us a car. That first car, and usually what we would do is with that first car, most people would say is, well, I would like to see a second one, and I would like to take it for a test drive. But the test drive, right, when we go to the test drive, what happens with the test drive? We want to do it not only in like some kind of sterile conditions, but when we want to take it for up in the hills, right, or we want to take it down in the valleys. Why? Because we want to see how the car performs in sort of stressful situations. Now, the reason why I brought up the idea of a test drive and a car, is because it comes up in this week's Parsha as well. In fact, if we look in Drush Dalid of the Zera Shimshon, he talks about Drush Dalid of Parshat Devarim. It says, Vayitav b'nei hadavar. The background to that is that Moshe is telling Bnei Israel that at the story of the Meraglim, he says that it was good in my eyes, good in his eyes. Rashi says there, he says, "Ve'im be'inei Moshe haya tov, lam amara b'tochachot." Right. So Rashi asks a very simple question: if it was good in Moshe's eyes, the idea that they should send meraglim, then why would it be in the rebuke? The whole Sefer Devarim is basically one section, one large rebuke. And if that's the case, why should we be included if Moshe agreed to it and understood it? Rashi continues, Mashallah Adam Shomer Lechavero Mechor Li Chamorcha Hazeh, Amar Lo Hein, Notno Ata L'Nisayon, Amar Lo Hein. Afani Hodati B'Dverchem Shema Tachzur Bachem Kshetiru Sheni Makeh V'Atem Lo Chazartem Bachem. Right, so like back in the used car salesman situation, Rashi brings a famous midrash that says when a person looking to buy a donkey, but in this case the car, right? He says, "I want to buy your car." So he says, "Great." Then he says, or I want to sell, I want to buy a car. So you say, great. You want to take it for a test drive? You say, great, right? You keep on saying yes. And, you keep on saying yes. But then what happens is usually Moshe was saying this, according to the Midrash, Moshe was saying is that if I kept on saying yes, 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 you would think that I'm on board, but you might say, well, I mean, I have a little bit of a concern because you keep on saying yes. And Moshe then that was Moshe's side of the story. But Israel, and this is what Moshe says according to the Midrash, right? He says, I agree to you, I admitted to you that maybe you would see that I'm not trying to resist, but and then I'm not giving you any pushback, and therefore you're going to say is, oh, if you're doing so quick about it, maybe there's something wrong, right? So therefore, but you did not. You didn't withdraw the request. In fact, the opposite. You went through with it. So the Zera Shimshon continues, Kasher deha mikol makom af lefi perush zeh lo sheyach lomar bayitav bein hadavar diyoter tevaya shelo yishalu klum el yaminu v'akadosh baruch hu v'Moshe. right? So the question that Zera Shimshon asks, he says, is even still, according to this midrash, which is the idea of the used car salesman, or the salesman, right? You tell him, I want to buy something. He says, great. And he keeps on saying, yes, yes, yes. And even so, right? It doesn't make sense to say that it was Vayitav B'nai Advar, that it was good in my eyes. That doesn't make sense because Moshe really didn't. He was just saying yes, 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 but he wasn't actually trying to get us to sell send them raglim. Rather, he would have wanted us to do what? He would have wanted us to, or he would have preferred that we would have trusted Hashem and in Moshe, saying that Eretz Yisrael is, is a great country. We don't need to start sending spies to test it out. So he continues. מדכאמר ויטע בין הדבר, נראה שהיה טוב בין משה שישאלו דבר זה, ואחר כך יודו לדבריו, יותר משאם האמינו בתחילה בלא שאלה כלל, וזה אינו לפי תירוצו של רש"י. Right? But since Moshe said ויטע בעיני הדבר, the fact that he said ויטע בעיני הדבר, that it was good in my eyes, right? It was apparently better in Moshe's eyes that they made this request, and then afterwards accept the words that the land was very good, better than if they had initially believed that the land was good without any question. But this is not according to the answer of Rashi. He's saying, meaning that from which it seems that Moshe strategically approved their request, but would have preferred that would have been not made at all. So that's, that the Vayitav B'nai Davar is, he says, yeah, I would have, sure, I would have loved for you to just trust in Hashem and trust in Eretz Yisrael and know that it's good. But the lesser of two evils is that, okay, so we'll send you. Well, you could send the spies, but I prefer that you don't do it at all. So yeah, I'll accept the fact, or I'll say yes to this idea of sending spies. But I really would have not preferred to do that. But either so, he says that doesn't make sense. This doesn't fit in with what Rashi answers on the person Vayitav B'nai Davar. Then the Zera Shimshon continues with another. He goes back to the story of the Meraglim, the original story of the Meraglim in Parshat Shlach Lecha, and it says, "Va'od yesh l'dakdek b'ma she'amar Moshe leMeraglim." If we look back at what Moshe said to the Meraglim, he says, "Ritem et ha'aretz mahi ha'chazaku rafeh hamatu imrav t'ma'u tzrach Moshe levarer lamhem davka inyanim elo v'alod hem dvarim pshutim shekol mishtaleach yashit libol dvarim elo b'li she'efresh otam tchila v'yad da'lo mar b'stam ritem et ha'aretz mahi." So the Zera Shimshon asks a very good question, which seems to be very obvious, and we would have all thought of it. Now that we hear it, we would have thought about it. And the question is, why does Moshe start outlining all these things that kind of says these are the things that you should be looking for, right? Whether it's a great nation or a large nation or a small nation, what is the number of the people? Are they weak or strong? How do we know they're strong? They're strong because they're standing outside without any borders, or if they're weak, they're standing in a city that's surrounded by some sort of wall. And right, and he says also, he asks the question about whether the land is fruitful. Does it bring bear fruit and things like that, right? And the question is, couldn't Moshe just said is go look at the land, just see that you should have see what the land is like, and along with the people who live there, and that's it. I mean, why do we have to start going into all the details of what you should be looking for within once you send the spies? So the Zera Shimshon, in typical fashion, tries to bring a halacha that is relevant, and then he tries to turn the entire, or answer the entire, all his questions through the lens of the halacha that he brought originally, in order to ask a second question, which is to answer a second question and then also answer the first question. So he's going to go in reverse order, answering the second question first. He's going to bring the halacha. The halacha is that when a person, and it says, Omnam ita b'shulchan aruch choshen mishpat siman reish lamed bet seif vav. It says that in the Shulchan Aruch Choshen Mishpat, it says that when I buy a car in the course of a sale of a car, or sale of any item, I find it to be defective. Kol she'iskimu alav b'nei hamedina shemachzirim bo hamekach ze machzirim. V'chol she'iskimu alav she'nomu harei ze eno machzir bo elo impiresh shekol hanosev noten stam al minhag hamedina usamech ad kan l'shano. So the halacha is that if a person, anything that the local people, I buy something, I find it to be defective, anything that the local people, they agree, there's a mutual agreement, there's the law of the land is that everyone says that this is a defect for which the item is in question can be returned, right? Then you're allowed to automatically return it. And anything that you agreed upon that is not such a defect, right? There's no such defect in that item, right? Then you can't return it unless you said this specific thing. So back to our used car salesman, if we buy the car and say this is I'm looking, I see that there's a dent on it. So then I can't return the car on a used car. I can't say this dent wasn't there or I don't like the dent that it's here. If I buy a brand new car and then I realize that the wheel fall, the wheel, the hubcap is falling off, or the engine light keeps on coming on, and that's within the normal agreed upon conditions, whether it's the terms of conditions of the sale or we buy, we add lines onto our contract or things like that. That's fine. But if it's not within the terms of conditions of the contract, then we can't go back and we don't have rights. We don't have a halachic right to go back. The question is, let's say I don't write a terms and conditions for whatever reason. I don't make a sale. I just say, yes, I agree to it. And then I have to go back. Then the law is that I have to go, the halacha is that I have to use the law of the land, whatever people have approved that that's normal within the normal range of things that we can ask for refund or things that we can ask for back, then those things are approved. Everything else, we're not within the guidelines. And using that as our base, we're going to explain why Moshe went into such detail. And I think this is really kind of atypical, but also kind of shows us the sheer magnitude of knowledge that does Zera Shimshon, how he applies this halacha to this situation. And it continues to Zera Shimshon. It seems that when Bnei Israel went to Moshe to send the spies, they reached a mutual agreement that said these are the defects or these are the things that we should be looking for, right? It might be the Hainu im yesham harov am, right? Except they might see they consider a defect if there's a lot of people. Imu chazakim, the Hainu sheishvu beprazim, shehu siman shemasar lehem lerot imu chazak, k'mo sheparash Rashi beparshat shalach lecha. Right, and he says one of them would be that how many people, the number of people that would be considered a defect, or if they're strong, that meaning that they live in open cities, right? That's also Rashi in Parshat Shlach says that's a sign that they are strong because they're not scared of people. If they were weak, they would be scared. They'd be surrounded by a wall. Right? It will also be considered a defect or a lack in the Eretz Yisrael chas v'chalila if the land was lean, meaning that or right? If there doesn't have trees. So this is why Moshe had to specify whether it's strong or weak or the various details. He said because it would in order to tell the people about the defects that they had already mutually agreed upon. Meaning, Moshe wanted to outline saying is if I don't tell you, and the Zera Shimshon's going to mention it, is if we don't have any terms and conditions, then you're going to find any flaw and you're going to say that's the reason why we don't want to go in. But if I were to say these are the things you should be looking for, and give us a survey of the land based on these parameters, then only within those parameters can you start looking, right? And that's what he's going to say. And that's what he says. And this is why it says Vayitav b'nei hadavar in this week's parsha. Moshe says, I didn't want to send you, but now that I'm sending you. Once I'm already sending you, let's make sure that the terms and conditions are agreed upon on both sides. So that way we don't have some sort of a situation where you start overanalyzing or start looking at things differently, right? In fact, he says. The Zera Shimshon says Moshe was so confident that Eretz Yisrael would not have any of these defects, so he said, "These are the things that I want you to look for because you're not going to find them." Now we can understand Rashi's answer is saying that he presents the comparison of the people's request to the sale of the donkey, the sale of the car, because he said yes, yes, yes to those outlined things. So if I'm saying yes to those outlined things and I'm confident in the sale, then no problem. He says when the person tells you, when you say I want to test a car going down the mountain or up the mountain, right? He says yes. And he says I'll take it for a test drive. Great, no problem, right? So now we have a good question that the Zera Shimshon says. Zera Shimshon asks, where do we see that there was some negotiation in terms of the terms and conditions between Moshe and Bnei Israel before settling the Meraglim? And he says, so he says, in fact, Bnei Israel only wanted to send spies. They didn't start going into the details. They just wanted to say, send spies. Moshe says, yes, we'll send spies, like to taking it for a test drive. But then he says, wait a minute, if we're going to send it, we're going to take it for a test drive. So let's do, here are the things I want you to look for, right? And he says, the Zera Shimshon asks a very good question. He says, how do we know that there was a back and forth? And the fact is, he says that we can infer it based on the fact that in Parshat Shlach, there are these, guidelines or outlines that Moshe gives. Otherwise, if there were no outlines, and he says, "V'im lo yimaskim b'zeh," היה חושש משה פנים אומרים שאף מה שאינו מום שהוא מום, אבל עתה שהסכימו אין להם פתחון פה לדבר. So he says, the very fact that there are outlines or there are guidelines or terms and conditions to this to the agreement proves that they agreed to it. Because if they weren't, and if there were no terms and conditions, they would find, like the white glove test or the test at all. It's a very general test that you do before you're doing any kind of sale, right? If I don't tell you what you're looking for, or I don't tell the mechanic what I'm looking for in the car, then he's going to find all the problems. And then what happens is I start having doubts, or I start saying that I can make up any flaw, and any flaw sounds good, and therefore the sale's not going to go through. But Moshe, based on the way that it's outlined in Parshat Shlach, Moshe says these are the terms and conditions. These are the things that you can find flaws within. That's the framework. Anything about that other than that, these are what you agreed upon. If you agree upon these things, then you can't open your mouth. And he says, "Pitchon peh." You can't have anything. You can't say negative things about Eretz Yisrael. In other words, Moshe said he wasn't happy, right? Moshe was definitely not happy about sending Meraglim, right? But he was pleased with having reached some sort of mutual agreement once they said, okay, I guess this is better than nothing, or better than sending spies just on without any terms and conditions, and then you're going to find flaws everywhere along the way, right? I'd rather you send them and we agree upon terms beforehand, and then once we do that, right, then we can say that, and he was assured, knew, Moshe was so confident in Eretz Yisrael that he didn't want to, he said, I know that these things, these outlined terms are not going to be any problems. You're not going to be able to find any flaws, right? But these are, and he knew that the Meraglim would not find or not be able to discuss these flaws or these things, because once these are the ones that we all agreed upon, that these are the ones that Eretz Yisrael, you may find things, but it's these. Moshe was so confident in Eretz Yisrael that he said, these are things that we can all agree upon that are not going to be problematic. And now, like it says, now, if we go back to Parshat Shlach, we see what it was Rashi say when it says Shiva Otan Davar, when Bnei Israel, the Meraglim, come back to Bnei Israel to tell them about what they saw in Eretz Yisrael. And it says, Rashi says there, "Be'ezel lashonim midabrim." Ad kan lashono, and then ma'achpat lahu lishal dat be'ezel lashonim midabrim. What does it matter? Is Rashi says that they wanted to know what Yeshiva Otan Davar wanted to know what language they spoke. Who cares what language they spoke? And rather, he says, Elo mipnei, rather Moshe mentioned that this because they agreed, mipnei sha'af zeh skimu b'neihem sheyumu. They also agreed that this, right? They also agreed upon the fact that the language might be a defect, right? So in other words, they were saying is Moshe knew that they're going to agree on terms, and they wanted to say, well, language might be a barrier, right? But here, interestingly, the Gur Aryeh, that is the Maharal Prague, asked the question, and he says that they didn't want to confront people. They didn't want to go to people that speak a different language, but rather what he says is it's not about the language. It's more about their line of thought, their line of thinking. And then to continue with that, he says, now up until now, Moshe has explained, Zera Shimshon has explained why Moshe was pleased with the idea that the people's requests, right? In other words, he said is, I don't like the idea at all, but if we're going to really do it, once we're doing, let's make sure that the conditions are agreed upon by both parties. And here are the things that you can look for in defects, because I'm so confident in the sale. That is, I'm so confident in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore I have nothing to worry about. So you want to talk about, the strength of the country. You want to talk about the land is, fruitful or not fruitful, et cetera, et cetera. No problem. I'm confident in Hashem and Eretz Yisrael, so I have nothing to worry about, even though I don't necessarily want to do it. I mean, I don't want to send the spies, but if we're going to send them, let's make sure that the terms and conditions are right. So now that we already understand we understand what Moshe's Avaitav Banei Davar, but the question is what Moshe motivated Rashi's comment, and why. It was why. If Moshe was pleased with the request, then how do we talk about it in the Tochacha, right? So we understand the concept and the logic of where Moshe was going with it, but we still don't answer the first question, which is why is it considered a Tochacha, a rebuke in Sefer Devarim, which is Moshe's farewell speech to all of Am Yisrael, right? So therefore we have a question. So he says, the arrangement did not help at all, right? In other words, the sale in terms of conditions of the sale did not help. In other words, they were making an agreement beforehand, and that should have been enough for them to say, okay, we accept the terms and conditions, and within that guidelines, these things are not considered defects. These things are, whatever. These are not things that we can talk negatively about. But he says, "Shamaraglim hotzi diba v'amru mumin shelo hiskimu b'nehem." The spies, we look at the Meraglim, and what happened is they made up stories. Within the mumim, the defects that they agreed upon, right? They exaggerated. They went above and beyond that which they agreed upon. And if we here's an example, right? So he says, "Kishem shepriya mishuna kach ama mishuna." Right? When they came back, we bring back these enormous fruits. That's a famous, that's one of the famous icons or pieces of information from the Miraglim, is they bring back this enormous fruit and say, just like this fruit is unusual, so are its people unusual, right? So he's saying is, אפילו שראו שהיו יושבים במצרים, שזהו סימן שהסכימו להכיר להם שהם חלשים, right? Even though they say, look, this fruit is massive fruit, which already is, part one is already answers the question whether they have fruit or not, or there's good fruit, or is it a barren land? That's part one. But not only they say the fruit is unusual, which is kind of taking and twisting the information, which is what they agreed upon. Not only that, they say the nation is strange. What does that mean? The nation is strange. Rashi there says that they are living in fortified cities, which is a sign of weakness. But that sign of weakness, they used it to their advantage. Instead of saying is they're a weak nation, we can conquer them, which is what they should have said, because that was in the agreed upon terms and conditions. They said is no, the fruit is large and strange, so too are the people, right? And therefore they took that same piece of information and negatively spun it around Eretz Yisrael. This is the sign that they grew up on, that they were weak. Even though they said they saw that they were weak, meaning that the city was fortified and the people were living in a walled city, which would be a sign of weakness, they said, no, they're greater than us. So they took that same information and spun it to their advantage, to their, narrative that they wanted. They still said they are stronger than us. So this is the reason why Moshe put it in the Tochachot. It's not that Moshe wasn't okay with, I guess in some ways better, like I said, lesser of two evils, that they send the Meraglim, but under the terms and conditions. But if once they send it, they agreed upon it, then you can't start, weaving a narrative. But that's exactly what Am Yisrael did, or the Meraglim did. The Meraglim saw and agreed and said, yes, we're going to we're going to follow the narrative that we agreed upon, Moshe. But then they spun it in their own way, and instead of just accepting that piece of information and saying here are the facts, they started telling a narrative, and they were scared. And that maybe it was fear, maybe it was something else, but that spinning of narrative is what caused Moshe to put it to include the Meraglim. And the fact that it says Veitav beinai davar is that I agreed to certain things, but what you took it is to the next level. You took it to spin a new narrative, which is not something that was agreed upon, and it's for that reason that Moshe includes it in the Tochachot. And also, I believe that is also something for us to learn for around Tisha B'Av. One of the reasons, besides for Avat Chinam that we have to kind of do tikkun, we also have to do is Avat, Avat Chinam doesn't necessarily only mean about other people. It also means about Eretz Yisrael. It means about what we say about Eretz Yisrael and what we and how we speak about Eretz Yisrael. And I don't remember which Rav it is, but I believe it was Rav Kook, but I'm not sure. He said that anyone who says anything negative, and he says if we compare our life to the life in Galut and say, oh, there is better, or it's great, the fruit there is great, or the things there are better, then we're in some ways talking negatively about Eretz Yisrael, right? If we're making comparisons, we should be saying Hashem gave us this land, and the land that we have here is filled with bracha, and there's lacking things in Galut that we have here. And we should never be saying is, oh, in America it's better, or in Galut it's better, or there they give us, prices are cheaper, or whatever it is. We should never making those comparisons, right? Hashem gives the bracha to Eretz Yisrael first, and then goes to the Galut, and then goes to the other places. So we should be looking at it from that perspective, and always looking at it as saying is that Eretz Yisrael, and we shouldn't be spinning things around to talk negatively. And in fact, nowadays, even more so, when we are pushed against the wall with our enemies, we shouldn't be saying that Eretz Yisrael, whether it's the people of Eretz Yisrael, whether it's the land of Eretz Yisrael, whatever it may be, we shouldn't be talking negatively about it. We should try our best to talk positively, find positive stories and positive narrative, so that way we're not ourselves contributing to the fact that Eretz Yisrael is still not in a complete way. So Hashem, that this week and continue our learning, we should also see the Geulah soon, and we also should see the Nechama of Yerushalayim, and hopefully we have an easy and meaningful fast. Have a wonderful Shabbat.